Do Western military bases in Africa truly have no alternatives? Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso seems determined to prove otherwise. Yet, can he withstand the consequences? Especially when past leaders like Thomas Sankara paid the ultimate price for taking a similar stand. And if he does, which nations will step forward to support Burkina Faso militarily? Let's find out. Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, has made a groundbreaking decision that's capturing global attention. He has aligned his country with two nations long known for defying Western dominance, Cuba and Venezuela, by welcoming their troops into Burkina Faso. This move goes far beyond diplomacy. It's about securing the nation's defense and asserting true independence. For decades, the West has maintained influence in Africa through military partnerships and economic dependency. Traoré's decision sends a powerful message. Like Cuba and Venezuela, Burkina Faso is ready to stand on its own, even if that means breaking ties with wealthy nations that still view Africa as a subordinate partner. So why does this worry the West? Because this alliance challenges the very foundation of Western control in Africa. If Burkina Faso can build stability and economic growth through partnerships based on equality rather than dependency, it undermines the idea that Africa needs Western aid to thrive. And if one nation can succeed this way, what's stopping others from following? Western power in Africa has long been transactional, offering military assistance in exchange for political influence or access to resources. But Traoré's decision to partner with nations that have resisted Western pressure for decades signals a shift toward alliances rooted in mutual respect and sovereignty. Unlike Western countries, Cuba and Venezuela don't impose financial conditions or political strings. Instead, they bring a legacy of solidarity with developing nations and a shared commitment to self-reliance. Is the West prepared for an Africa that charts its own course? In Western capitals, Traoré's move will likely be seen as a threat to long-standing interests on the continent. But his message is clear. Burkina Faso will no longer be anyone's pawn. This new era could inspire a wave of African nations to reclaim control over their alliances, breaking free from the political and economic constraints of the past. It's a potential turning point, one that could redefine Africa's global role and permanently shift the balance of power. And that brings us to the key question: why Cuba and Venezuela? Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Please do not forget to subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's continue. Burkina Faso's decision to align with Venezuela and Cuba may seem unconventional at first glance. Traditionally, alliances are built on geographic proximity or economic power, but this partnership goes far deeper. It carries powerful symbolic and strategic meaning. Both Cuba and Venezuela have spent decades standing firm against Western dominance, particularly that of the United States, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of sanctions, blockades, and political isolation. Their histories mirror Africa's own struggle against colonization and exploitation, serving as living examples of what it means to defend sovereignty under immense external pressure. These nations share a deeply rooted anti-imperialist philosophy. They've built systems centered on self-sufficiency and national pride, resisting Western interference as part of their identity. Burkina Faso's alliance with them isn't merely about gaining military aid. It's about solidarity among nations that value independence over compliance. Through this partnership, President Traoré is making a statement. Burkina Faso will no longer seek validation or direction from Western powers. Instead, it will walk alongside those who have proven it's possible to survive and even prosper without Western approval or assistance. Take Cuba, for example. Despite enduring some of the harshest sanctions in modern history, it developed one of the world's most respected healthcare systems, excelling in medical training and preventative care. Venezuela, rich in energy resources, continues to push for economic autonomy, despite ongoing Western pressure. For Burkina Faso, these alliances bring both ideological and practical benefits. The experience of Cuba and Venezuela in guerrilla warfare, sanctions resistance, and building independent defense systems offers valuable lessons for a nation determined to reduce external dependency. Moreover, their expertise can help Burkina Faso strengthen key sectors such as healthcare and energy, two pillars of national stability. Cuba has already pledged to send medical professionals to help Burkina Faso develop a stronger healthcare system, reducing its reliance on Western aid. Meanwhile, Venezuela's energy cooperation could help Burkina Faso address frequent electricity shortages by creating more sustainable, self-sufficient power systems, cutting costs and freeing up resources for development. Beyond immediate military or economic gains, this partnership represents a direct rejection of the Western debt model that has trapped many African nations for decades. Historically, Africa's development has been tied to financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF, whose loans often come with policy conditions that limit sovereignty. In 2023, the African Development Bank reported that around 40% of sub-Saharan African nations were either in debt distress or dangerously close, largely due to reliance on Western financial aid. Traoré's new alliances with Cuba and Venezuela sidestep this dependency cycle entirely. Instead of imposing economic control, these nations promote fair trade, skill exchange, and local empowerment. Their approach emphasizes resource management, healthcare training, and sustainable industry development rather than profit extraction. On the military front, Cuban and Venezuelan troops bring decades of strategic experience in resisting foreign intervention. Their expertise in community-based defense, guerrilla tactics, and infrastructure resilience aligns perfectly with Burkina Faso's broader goal of building self-sufficient security systems. Unsurprisingly, this alliance has raised alarms in Western capitals, especially among former colonial powers like France, which have long maintained influence in West Africa under the guise of stability or counterterrorism. For them, Burkina Faso's pivot toward anti-imperialist allies is more than a geopolitical shift. It's a challenge to the very structure of Western dominance in the region. Burkina Faso's decision to forge new alliances outside Western influence forces the world to reconsider who truly benefits from the long-standing foreign military presence in Africa. Should anyone be surprised that Western powers are uneasy? After all, if African nations can achieve peace, security, and independence without Western intervention, the entire foundation of Western aid and influence begins to crumble. The arrival of Venezuelan and Cuban troops marks more than a symbolic gesture. It represents a realignment of power. It signals a move away from dependence on Western military and financial support toward partnerships built on mutual respect and sovereignty. For the West, this is deeply unsettling, as it proves that Africa can indeed stand on its own, free from the shadow of its former colonial powers. This new partnership could easily become a blueprint for other African nations. Observing Burkina Faso's bold strategy, more countries may recognize that they too can pursue alliances that foster true autonomy rather than reinforce dependency. If this trend gains traction, it could reshape the balance of power across Africa, challenging the rationale behind Western intervention and encouraging a new wave of independent diplomacy. However, history shows that the West rarely surrenders influence willingly. Western nations may attempt to sway African governments or manipulate public perception, painting these emerging coalitions as threats to stability or progress. Yet in reality, it isn't Africa's stability that's at risk. It's Western dominance. The irony is clear. Those who claim to support African freedom often brand the continent's pursuit of genuine independence as destabilizing. This narrative not only distorts reality, but also exposes a lingering paternalistic mindset toward African autonomy. Looking ahead, Traoré's alliances with Cuba and Venezuela may represent far more than a short-term political maneuver. For many Africans, they embody a vision of the future, one in which nations prioritize sovereignty, equality, and shared progress over foreign dependence. This shift is part of a growing geopolitical transformation across Africa. The rise of South-South cooperation, similar to Burkina Faso's new partnerships, offers a credible alternative to traditional Western-led development models. Unlike the transactional aid relationships of the past, these collaborations focus on mutual growth, technology exchange, and sustainable progress. Research by the African Union supports this direction, showing that countries engaged in South-South partnerships tend to achieve more resilient and sustained development than those relying primarily on Western aid. These partnerships allow nations to pool expertise and resources without the political strings or debt traps that often accompany Western assistance. That said, Traoré's path is not without risks. Aligning with Cuba and Venezuela invites criticism, economic pressure, and possibly even retaliatory measures from Western powers. But for many Africans, his stance resonates deeply. It reflects a renewed spirit of resistance and self-determination. By reducing its reliance on Western influence, Burkina Faso is setting a powerful precedent that could reshape African diplomacy. Its example may inspire other nations to rethink their alliances and pursue genuine independence. Could this be the spark that ignites a broader continental movement? If more African countries choose partnerships rooted in sovereignty rather than dependency, we could witness the dawn of a new era in African diplomacy, one defined by collaboration, respect, and self-reliance rather than external control. Unsurprisingly, Western capitals are already discussing economic sanctions, a familiar tactic to reassert control and discourage defiance. Yet, with this bold move, Burkina Faso has shown that Africa's future doesn't have to be written by its former colonizers. It can and must be authored by Africans themselves. But doesn't the imposition of sanctions reveal more about Western insecurity than about Burkina Faso's defiance? If the nation's alliance with Cuba and Venezuela is truly insignificant, why such a dramatic reaction from the West? Cuba and Venezuela, after all, are no strangers to economic sanctions. Over the years, both countries have adapted, reshaping their economies to withstand external pressure. Through these partnerships, Burkina Faso gains not only moral solidarity, but also practical expertise, learning how to mitigate and survive sanctions while safeguarding national interests. With Venezuela's support in the energy sector and Cuba's contribution to healthcare, Burkina Faso is reinforcing its resilience in critical areas, reducing dependency on Western aid and approval. By drawing on the hard-earned lessons of its allies, Burkina Faso is building a self-sustaining economy that can stand firm in the face of foreign economic coercion. The West's reaction, punishment instead of encouragement, speaks volumes. It reveals a deep discomfort with the idea of an independent Africa. The message is clear. Western powers appear more threatened by African self-sufficiency than by instability itself. Yet sanctions may backfire. Many in Burkina Faso may interpret them as an attack on their country's right to self-determination, rallying even greater support for President Traoré's leadership. While Western nations may hope to weaken Burkina Faso's independence, the partnerships with Cuba and Venezuela provide a roadmap for resilience. One that, if successful, could inspire other African countries to follow suit and seek alternatives to Western-dominated aid systems. This raises a profound question. What if Africa cut ties with the West altogether? Such a shift would mark one of the most transformative periods in modern history. For too long, Africa's potential has been suppressed by exploitative systems, resource extraction, and economic dependency that enrich others at the continent's expense. Imagine an Africa that fully controls its resources, policies, and economic destiny. An Africa unburdened by external interference. This vision represents not isolation, but empowerment. A continent united through regional cooperation, fair trade, and self-determination. The long-standing Western claim that Africa needs outside help to progress is rooted in outdated colonial paternalism. Western aid has rarely been altruistic. It often comes with strings attached. Policies that favor foreign corporations, structural adjustments that undermine local industries, and loans that trap nations in debt. Freeing itself from these constraints would allow Africa to invest in intracontinental trade, nurture local industries, and ensure that profits directly benefit African people, instead of boosting Western economies. After all, why should Africa's oil, diamonds, and coffee be sold for pennies only to be re-imported at inflated prices? An autonomous Africa could establish fair market values, ensuring that wealth generated from its natural resources stays within the continent, fueling infrastructure, education, and technological innovation. Take Burkina Faso, for example, a nation rich in gold, yet among the poorest in the world, despite its vast mineral wealth. France still prints Burkina Faso's colonial currency and reportedly benefits from nearly half of the nation's export revenue, including gold. The bitter irony is that much of the gold mined by Burkinabe workers, often even children, ends up enriching foreign treasuries rather than local communities. This reality underscores why leaders like Traoré are seeking a new path. The struggle is not just about politics or ideology. It's about reclaiming economic justice and sovereign control over African resources. Critics often argue that maintaining stability in Africa necessitates a Western military presence. Yet this notion serves as little more than a thinly disguised justification for control, protecting military bases that primarily advance Western interests under the banner of security. A closer look reveals that these installations have frequently exacerbated local tensions instead of resolving them. Rather than stabilizing the continent, they have entrenched dependency and hindered Africa's ability to handle its own affairs. By moving away from these so-called security partnerships, African nations could forge alliances that honor their sovereignty, potentially with non-Western partners willing to collaborate without demanding control. Western-led defense systems have rarely empowered Africa. Instead, they have often reduced it to a pawn in global power rivalries. An independent Africa, free from such external entanglements, could take charge of its own security. Working collectively, African nations could establish a continental defense strategy, strengthening regional unity while nurturing an African identity that stands on its own, unshaped by foreign influence. And what about claims that the West fosters cultural and technological exchange? These arguments are equally misleading. Africa has always possessed a rich cultural heritage and a fast-growing technology sector capable of rivaling global innovators. The implication that Africa cannot drive its own creative and technological revival is rooted in outdated paternalism. Free from Western domination, Africa could celebrate and invest in its own cultural identity, inspiring a new generation to embrace their heritage with pride. Such independence would uplift morale, deepen solidarity, and strengthen bonds across the continent. Breaking ties with the West does not mean isolation. It represents a redefinition of partnership. It opens doors for Africa to engage with allies who treat it as an equal. Imagine the possibilities. Meaningful collaborations with nations in South America, Asia, and within Africa itself. Unburdened by the exploitative conditions historically imposed by Western powers. Through these equitable alliances, Africa could emerge as a formidable global blot. One recognized not as a dependent region, but as a partner with influence, vision, and purpose. Environmental stewardship is another crucial dimension. For decades, Western influence in Africa has prioritized corporate profit over ecological preservation, leading to widespread pollution and biodiversity loss. Many foreign companies have exploited Africa's natural resources with little regard for environmental consequences. By reclaiming authority, Africa could set its own environmental agenda, one centered on sustainable development, eco-friendly practices, and the protection of its unique ecosystems. Africa could lead the world in creating green solutions tailored to its own needs, rather than following external agendas that often harm its environment. Critics may continue to argue that such independence is unrealistic, that severing ties with the West would invite chaos or collapse. But this view underestimates Africa's resilience and ignores the growing movement across the continent towards self-sufficiency and regional solidarity. Africa does not merely have the capacity to survive without the West. It has the potential to thrive. True progress lies in charting a course defined by African priorities, African innovation, and African leadership. Severing exploitative ties isn't about closing doors. It's about opening new ones. It's about creating opportunities rooted in equality, sustainability, and respect. In the end, Burkina Faso's partnership with Cuba and Venezuela is about more than just strategy. It's a symbol of renewal. It embodies a vision of African sovereignty and a rejection of the historical dominance that has shaped the continent's geopolitics for far too long. If successful, Burkina Faso's stance could inspire a continent-wide awakening, a wave of nations ready to reclaim their independence and redefine their place in the world. So we're left with vital questions. Is this the dawn of a new era of African autonomy? Will other nations follow Burkina Faso's lead? What will Africa look like when the West finally steps back? And most importantly, does Africa truly need the West to prosper? Tell us what you think in the comments section below.